every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The pursuit of Olympic gold requires an unimaginable sacrifice. For the young women of American gymnastics, the price of perfection is paid in shattered bones, torn ligaments, and a relentless, crushing pressure to push the human body beyond its natural limits. In this isolated, high-stakes world, pain is a constant companion, and vulnerability is a weakness to be hidden. Athletes are taught from childhood to obey authority without question, to endure agony in silence, and to trust the adults tasked with their care. But what happens when that trust is weaponized? What happens when the sanctuary of the medical tent becomes a hunting ground, and the very institutions designed to protect athletes become architects of their suffering? Today, we dissect the anatomy of institutional enablers. We are examining the catastrophic systemic failures of USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We will explore how these powerful entities, driven by a toxic mix of self-preservation, willful ignorance, and a win-at-all-costs mentality, provided a protective shield for Larry Nassar, allowing the largest sexual abuse scandal in sports history to fester for decades. This is not just the story of a predator. This is the story of the walls that were built to protect him and the courageous women who tore them down. To understand how Larry Nassar operated with such devastating impunity, we must first examine the environment in which he thrived. Elite gymnastics in the United States, particularly from the 1990s through the 2000s, was dominated by a culture of fear and absolute control. At the epicenter of this culture was the Caroli Ranch in Huntsville, Texas. The ranch was the designated national training center for USA Gymnastics, a sprawling, remote compound where the brightest young talents in the country were summoned to prove their worth. It was a place of isolation, deliberately cut off from parents and outside influence. At the ranch, athletes were subjected to grueling, 12-hour training days, strict dietary restrictions, and intense psychological pressure. The goal was to build unshakable competitors, but the byproduct was a profound vulnerability. The gymnasts endured severe calorie restriction and frequent public shaming regarding their weight and performance. The constant, looming threat was the loss of an Olympic roster spot, an outcome that would render a lifetime of physical sacrifice meaningless. These girls were isolated, exhausted, hungry, and desperately seeking a sliver of kindness in a harsh, unforgiving landscape. Larry Nassar understood this landscape perfectly. He did not present himself as an authoritarian figure. Instead, he carefully cultivated the persona of the gentle, caring confidant. He was the quirky, disarming doctor who smuggled forbidden snacks into the athletes' rooms, listened to their grievances about the intense coaching methods, and offered a soft, sympathetic ear. In an environment defined by discipline and deprivation, Nassar positioned himself as the sole source of comfort. This was a calculated, predatory strategy. By establishing himself as the girls' advocate and protector, he ensured that his authority was absolute and unquestioned. When athletes came to him with chronic back pain, pelvic injuries, or stress fractures, they believed they were in the safest possible hands. Nassar exploited this trust by weaponizing his medical credentials. He pioneered what he termed intravaginal or intrarectal adjustments, claiming they were specialized osteopathic treatments for pelvic floor injuries and back pain. He performed these invasive, abusive procedures under the guise of medical necessity, often without gloves, and sometimes with parents or coaches sitting just feet away in the same room. The brilliance of his methodology lay in its audacity. by conducting his abuse in plain sight and cloaking it in complex medical jargon. He short-circuited the victim's ability to recognize it as assault. The athletes, conditioned to endure pain and obey coaches and doctors implicitly, assumed the discomfort and violation they felt were simply part of the agonizing process of healing. If they questioned the treatment, they were often dismissed or told that Nassar was a world-renowned expert, the best in his field, and a crucial component of their Olympic dreams. The psychological manipulation was so profound that many athletes blamed themselves for feeling uncomfortable, assuming their lack of medical knowledge was the issue, not the actions of the esteemed national team doctor. But the facade of the miracle worker was not maintained by Nassar alone. It was actively reinforced by the institutions that employed him. Michigan State University, where Nassar served as a sports medicine physician and faculty member, was his primary base of operations for 20 years. The university provided him with a veneer of academic and medical legitimacy that was essential to his predatory success. More damningly, the university repeatedly failed to act on clear, explicit warnings. The anatomy of an institutional enabler begins with the suppression of the first dissenting voice. In 1997, a young athlete named Larissa Boyce confided in the university's gymnastics coach about Nassar's inappropriate treatments. Instead of launching a thorough investigation, the coach dismissed the concerns, defending Nassar's medical expertise and warning the athletes about the severe consequences of making false allegations. The message sent to the young women was unmistakable. The institution stands with the doctor, and your voice does not matter. The safety of the athletes was subordinate to the reputation of the medical staff. This pattern of willful blindness at Michigan State University continued for decades. In 2014, a recent graduate filed a formal Title IX complaint against Nassar, detailing the specific nature of his sexual abuse during medical examinations. This was a critical juncture, a moment where the university had a legal and moral obligation to halt the abuse. Instead, the university's response was a masterclass in bureaucratic self-preservation. They conducted a deeply flawed internal investigation, relying heavily on the testimony of medical experts who were Nassar's close colleagues. The investigator concluded that Nassar's procedures were medically appropriate and cleared him of all wrongdoing. He was allowed to return to his practice, continuing his abuse of patients for another 16 months. The institution had effectively investigated itself and found itself blameless, prioritizing the reputation of its star physician over the safety of the young women entrusted to its care. Even when public pressure mounted years later, the university's initial legal strategy was aggressively defensive, attempting to shield itself from liability by invoking sovereign immunity and arguing they were not responsible for the actions of a rogue employee, despite decades of ignored warnings. While Michigan State University provided Nassar's daily cover, USA Gymnastics provided his access to the most elite athletes in the world. As the national governing body for the sport, USA Gymnastics was consumed by a singular overarching mandate: winning medals. Under the leadership of figures like President Steve Penny, the organization cultivated an incredibly lucrative brand, built entirely on the success and marketability of its young female gymnasts. Protecting that brand became the paramount concern, superseding all other responsibilities. When USA Gymnastics was confronted with undeniable evidence of Nassar's abuse in the summer of 2015, their immediate instinct was not to protect the athletes, but to manage the crisis. In June of that year, an Olympic gymnast confided in her coach about Nassar's abuse, triggering a chain of reporting that reached the highest levels of USA Gymnastics. The organization hired a private investigator, not to aid law enforcement immediately, but to conduct an internal review and assess the potential financial and public relations damage to the organization. For 5 agonizing weeks, as they secretly investigated the claims, USA Gymnastics did not report Nassar to the authorities. They did not warn Michigan State University, and they did not alert the parents of the countless gymnasts who continued to see him for treatment. They allowed a known predator to quietly resign, framing his departure as a retirement to protect him from public scrutiny and, by extension, to protect themselves from a catastrophic scandal. The priority was containment, not justice. When USA Gymnastics finally reported the allegations to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in July 2015, they chose to go directly to the Indianapolis field office. This decision was not arbitrary. The headquarters of USA Gymnastics is located in Indianapolis, and the organization's leadership had cultivated a cozy back-channel relationship with the special agent in charge, W.J. Abbott. During a meeting, Steve Penny handed over a dossier containing allegations from 3 elite gymnasts. What transpired next represents one of the most egregious failures in the history of federal law enforcement. The FBI was handed the names of multiple Olympic athletes who had been sexually abused by a serial predator operating on an international stage. The mandate could not have been clearer, yet the Indianapolis office essentially did nothing. The anatomy of this law enforcement failure is complex, rooted in negligence, poor communication, and a shocking lack of urgency. Agent Abbott and his team failed to open a formal investigation for months. They did not interview the victims in a timely manner. They did not secure Nassar's electronics, and they did not notify local authorities in Michigan where Nassar lived and worked. The case languished in a bureaucratic void. Internal communications later revealed that the FBI agents minimized the allegations, debated jurisdictional issues, and inexplicably transferred the case to the Los Angeles field office, further delaying any meaningful action. In a staggering display of conflicted interests, Special Agent Abbott even engaged in discussions with Steve Penny about a potential job opportunity at the United States Olympic Committee while the Nassar investigation was supposedly active. During this protracted period of federal inaction, from the summer of 2015 to the fall of 2016, Larry Nassar continued to treat patients at Michigan State University and a local gymnastics club. Dozens of young girls and women were sexually abused during this window, their trauma entirely preventable if the FBI had simply done its job. The complicity deepened when it was later discovered that FBI agents had actually falsified official reports. An agent in the Indianapolis office fabricated statements attributed to one of the Olympic gymnasts, minimizing the severity of the abuse and omitting critical details that would have necessitated immediate action. This was not a mere oversight. It was an active obstruction of justice that insulated Nassar and allowed the systemic failure to persist. The very agency tasked with investigating complex, multi-jurisdictional crimes had become the ultimate enabler, paralyzed by incompetence and blinded by its own bureaucratic dysfunction. The safety of children had been sacrificed on the altar of institutional inertia. The tipping point, the moment the elaborate architecture of protection finally began to collapse, did not originate from within these institutions. It came from a fiercely intelligent, incredibly brave survivor named Rachel Den Hollander. Recognizing the futility of reporting to the very entities that had protected Nassar, Den Hollander bypassed the sports organizations and universities entirely. In 2016, she filed a meticulous, detailed police report with the Michigan State University Police Department, forcing local law enforcement to initiate a criminal investigation. Simultaneously, she took the extraordinary risk of going on the record with the Indianapolis Star. The resulting investigative journalism by Tim Evans, Marissa Kwiatkowski, and Mark Alicia was the catalyst that shattered the silence. Their relentless reporting exposed the systemic cover-ups at USA Gymnastics and brought Den Hollander's story into the devastating light of public scrutiny. The publication of the newspaper investigation changed the trajectory of the case forever. It provided a beacon for other survivors, validating their experiences and proving they were not alone. The floodgates opened. Women and girls who had carried the suffocating weight of this secret for years, decades in some cases, began to come forward. The scale of the horror, once hidden behind locked clinic doors and bureaucratic red tape, was finally laid bare. It was no longer a matter of isolated incidents. It was an epidemic of abuse, a staggering indictment of a sporting culture that had commodified its athletes and discarded their humanity. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in their emotional scope and public impact. Larry Nassar ultimately pleaded guilty to federal child pornography charges and multiple state charges of criminal sexual conduct. But the true reckoning occurred in a Michigan courtroom presided over by Judge Rosemary Aquilina. Recognizing the profound need for the survivors to reclaim their voices, Judge Aquilina allowed any victim who wished to speak to deliver an impact statement. For 7 agonizing, powerful days, 156 women and girls addressed the court. They spoke of the stolen innocence, the shattered dreams, and the enduring psychological trauma. They directed their righteous fury not just at the man who abused them, but at the institutions that had turned a blind eye. This courtroom became the site of a profound cultural shift. The survivors, once isolated and silenced, forged an unbreakable sisterhood in front of the watching world. They transformed themselves from victims into fierce advocates, demanding accountability not just for Nassar, but for the entire corrupt ecosystem that had sustained him. The anatomy of an institutional enabler was laid bare by the very people it had tried to crush. Judge Aquilina, acting as a surrogate for the justice system that had previously failed these women, sentenced Nassar to up to 175 years in state prison. The fallout from the scandal completely dismantled the leadership structures of the enabling institutions. The president of Michigan State University resigned in disgrace, and the university eventually agreed to a massive $500 million settlement with the survivors. The entire board of directors of USA Gymnastics was forced to resign, and the organization filed for bankruptcy under the crushing weight of litigation. The president of USA Gymnastics, Steve Penny, was indicted on charges of tampering with evidence related to the investigation. Even the FBI faced a searing internal reckoning, with the Department of Justice Inspector General issuing a scathing report detailing the inexcusable failures of the Indianapolis field office and leading to the termination of the agents involved. Yet, the true legacy of this dark chapter is not found in the collapse of these institutions, but in the indomitable strength of the survivors. Their courage forced a global reckoning on the culture of elite sports, leading to sweeping legislative changes and the creation of new oversight bodies designed to protect amateur athletes. They proved that even the most deeply entrenched systems of power can be dismantled by the relentless pursuit of truth. They exposed the dangerous reality that institutions, left unchecked, will almost always default to self-preservation, protecting the brand, the reputation, and the bottom line at the expense of human life. We dissect cases like this not merely to recount the horror, but to understand the mechanics of complicity. The Larry Nassar scandal teaches us that a predator rarely operates in a vacuum. They thrive in the shadows cast by towering institutions, sustained by a culture of deference, the silencing of dissent, and the cowardly prioritization of prestige over protection. The anatomy of an enabler is found in every ignored email, every suppressed report, and every delayed investigation. True justice requires more than locking away the monster. It demands that we dismantle the labyrinth of protection that allowed him to hunt. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.